Hello and welcome to Week 11, Part 3 of EGM310, Visual Interpretation. In this lesson, we will learn about how we can use our eyes, brain, and experience to interpret the things that we see in remotely sensed images. With remote sensing, our goal is most often to answer some sort of research question. This could be something like, how much of the Earth's surface is covered by glaciers? How much forest area has burned in a given year in California? Or, more generally, how has land use changed over time in a given area? When we use remote sensing to answer these questions, the images that we are using are raw data. That is, we can use the images to answer the questions, but first we have to interpret the images to convert that raw data into information that we can use. We can do this via visual interpretation, as we will talk about today, or as we'll talk about in Lesson 5 this week, we can use the computer to help us interpret one or many images. We are well practiced in interpreting images. It's one of the main ways that we interact with the world. In doing so, we draw on our experiences or prior knowledge. For example, we can look at this image and see yellow sunflowers, white clouds, and a blue sky. In this image, we can see trees, grass, and bushes. We can also see cows grazing in the fields. We can see the rolling hills in the background, and we can see blue sky or white clouds. If we look at this image, we can see a dress. Often, we can do this because the images that we're looking at make sense to us. We have experience seeing these objects and seeing the world from these particular angles. Remote sensing images, on the other hand, can be much more difficult to interpret. Most remote sensing images are taken from a very unfamiliar perspective. We're not that used to seeing the world from directly above. The scales and resolution of most images is unfamiliar as well. In many of the images that we'll work with, a house is only a few pixels at most. The sunflowers in this image would be maybe 1 pixel in a high-resolution satellite image. Remote sensing often requires us to make use of other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, things that we usually have no prior experience looking at. As we've seen, many things look very, very different in the shortwave infrared than they do in the visible wavelengths. We can think about a number of different elements of visual interpretation to help aid us. These are techniques that we also use, often subconsciously, in other aspects of our lives when confronted with things that aren't familiar to us. You might recognize this image immediately, or you might not right away. But you can certainly recognize different things within it by their shapes, roads or buildings, for example. You might notice that some of these buildings are small, perhaps houses, while other buildings are maybe a bit larger. You might also recognize different patterns. Cars in a car park, for example. You might notice that some of these different objects have a regular pattern. They might look like agricultural fields of some kind. You can also see that some of the plants in these fields look more green than in other fields. This might indicate different crops, or maybe we're looking at fields that haven't been planted yet, or maybe they've already been harvested. We can also see that some of these green areas look very smooth, while others are not. This could indicate that we're looking at trees instead of crops. We can also see shadows, which again helps to perhaps confirm that we're looking at trees. We can use some of the different context clues to identify what we're looking at. Several large car parks next to a series of larger buildings. Finally, think about the resolution of the image that we're looking at. In a lower resolution image, we probably wouldn't imagine that we'd be looking at cars in a car park. But because this appears to be a very high resolution image, we can be confident in that interpretation. We'll go through some more examples of image interpretation in the rest of this lesson. Each of the images that I'm using in this lesson come from Google Earth, but I'm not going to tell you where or what we're looking at just yet. In the live session this week, we'll spend some time discussing these and similar examples, and we'll see how well you can identify these different locations. I'll post these images on Blackboard so that you can have a better look. things might be a bit more difficult to interpret from the lecture video or even the PDF of the slides. When we talk about the shape of an object, what we mean is its form or outline. For example, we might look at the large rectangular object in the middle of this image and see that it's a football pitch, since we can actually make out the lines on the pitch. But what about some of the other objects that we can see? There are definitely buildings of some kind, but are they houses? To help interpret these, we might also think about how large the different objects are. What about this building here next to the football pitch? Is it a house? It could be, but it's pretty small. So maybe it's also a storage shed or something similar, given that it's located right next to what we already identified as a football pitch. We can see a number of other buildings here at the top of the image that are slightly larger. These are probably houses, and the way that they're arranged suggests that maybe we're looking at a village, or at least a smaller neighborhood in a larger town or city. If we want to also work on identifying some of the different tree species that we can see here, or at least differentiating between them, we should also think about the context. Where on Earth are we? If we think that we're in a cooler environment, we probably wouldn't guess that these are tropical plant species. And again, see if you can use what you see in this image to try to work out where this image was taken. And we'll discuss this more later this week. When we talk about texture, we mean how often the tone or brightness or color of the image changes. For example, we see lots of green in this image. But some of these green objects are quite smooth. We don't see lots of changes within the object itself. In the green areas at the top of the image, though, we can see lots of darker and brighter spots within the larger object, and the shifts from brighter to darker take place over short spatial scales. That is, they look rough. As you might have guessed, these are trees, while these are different agricultural fields. Whether objects appear smooth or rough depends on the size of the object relative to the image scale. If these areas with trees were only a few pixels, for example, they wouldn't have the same texture at all. But because the image resolution is fine enough, we can see the textural variation caused by the different heights and shapes of the trees. Pattern is another feature that we can use to identify objects in an image. It refers to the spatial arrangement of objects in an image. Very often, it means a repetition of form, such as the repeating circular objects that we can see here, or the repeated regular rectangles that we see over here. Patterns can come from both natural and constructed objects. We might have to use other clues to help us out. Given the surrounding area, which looks to be mostly free of vegetation, we might conclude that these are in fact constructed. These are agricultural fields within some sort of perhaps arid environment. As I've alluded to so far, we can also use the tone or the hue and color to differentiate objects. We've discussed how different plan types have different reflectances. For example, we can see that the trees in the image, down here for example, or up here, in addition to differences in texture, these also have different colors. They appear darker green, while the fields that we see have different shades of green, or even different shades of tan or brown. Tone or hue is often one of the main properties we can use to differentiate objects, although it may not be sufficient on its own. Many different objects can have similar looking reflectance in any given band, which is why we often try to use multiple bands wherever possible. Shadows can also help us interpret the things that we see in images. In this image, we see a number of circular objects that aren't necessarily all alike. This group up here appears fairly flat, while this group down here are all casting shadows, suggesting that these are some kind of structure, while these are not. Shadows can also make interpretation more difficult, as they might obscure objects. This can be especially true in mountainous areas, for example. Shadows can also enhance the topography in images, and we can even use shadows in an image to calculate the height of the objects that we can see. In this lesson, we've discussed how our goal in remote sensing is often to turn the raw data contained in images into information that we can use. Remote sensing images can also often be difficult to interpret. They're usually at unfamiliar viewing angles, and they have a different scale than what we're used to in our day-to-day lives. Using the context and the clues that we can see in images can help. It's a bit like detective work. And like many things, it does get easier the more that you practice. Once again, you can read more about the concepts that we've covered in this lesson in the textbooks, Chapter 1 of Lillesand, Kiefer, and Chipman, and Chapter 5 of Campbell and Wynne. This is also covered in the remote sensing tutorials provided by Natural Resources Canada. I've included a link to a project from the University of Plymouth called Glacier Map. This is a project that's looking to crowdsource the mapping of glaciers in the Cordillera Blanca Mountains in Peru to help engage the general public and communicate information about water resources, glaciers, and climate change. You can click on the link and go to the website to read more about the project and to actually do the mapping. Finally, you can use Google Earth or Google Maps to get more experience looking at satellite images. At the very least, you can see some really cool, beautiful imagery. That's all for this lesson. I hope you found it interesting, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or post in the discussion forum on Blackboard. Bye!